looking at technology as an enabler as opposed to a necessity, I guess.
Hey everyone, this is Stu. You're listening to the Flow State podcast, and we are back for our third and final episode with Jennifer Arnold on the voice of the customer. We're getting stuck straight into our obsession with tools and data, so sit back and enjoy the show. But your point around like that sort of very sort of human experience of like feeling crap, feeling vulnerable, needing assistance, like that's the bit that I think causes a lot of the frustration when you're trying to deal with those bad customer experiences from the business world, because you don't get treated like that. You get treated like whatever, like a number or a ticket in
a piggy bank.
Well, exactly, like a wallet basically. And it's just it's surprising to me that like I saw a lot of this commentary around like when we were doing the AI series last year that the amount of technology we now have, ironically, was supposed to help us spend more time being people, but it feels like you sort of spend most of your time actually trying to service tools and technology, which sort of continues to chip away at the actual human side of interacting with each other.
And I think this quest for data, I do some work in the sales operations space and marketing operations space, and this quest for data as well is like everything needs to be documented, every call, every email, every outcome. And so that it puts a lot of pressure on the sales and marketing teams. They could spend half their day just reporting on the activities that they've done, So I think, again, here is looking at technology as an enabler as opposed to a necessity, I guess, is, how, again, back to automation, there are a lot of ways that you can do that. You were talking about using intercom. There are lots, again, these things are being built into these tools that if you're running a sequence, it will actually, track that for you, and it will record calls, it'll take transcripts of calls, etc. You as a salesperson don't have to enter all of that information, which should free up time for you, ideally. But manually, again, it's getting people to use the technology that's there. I've found salespeople particularly are very good at finding workarounds for those things, and not putting the data in because they don't want to have the oversight and scrutiny, right?
That's very surprising then.
Whereas the marketers are the ones that are like, no, we need to know exactly what happened. We need to hit these KPIs. But I think there are a lot more tools. Again, AI. One of my friends is working in this space. She's starting up a consultancy and an organization that looks at what are the AI tools that you can use to support the sales process. Just that. She's just primarily focused on that. And there's a lot coming out to market. Again, the major platforms, the Salesforces, the Microsofts, the SAPs are building those tools into their platforms. So that it's just putting it at the hands of everybody, and it's not just down to the sales operations people to do all of that tracking. So hopefully it'll make it easier, and it will free up time for salespeople and marketers to actually spend more time in person in front of a customer and thinking about the strategy behind what they're doing, and not just pumping through the process.
I mean, I think that's like the key thing, right? Like, it's because I've been the same way. Obviously work with a lot of salespeople through the course of our programs and in previous roles, and like I do, as much as it's fun to obviously take the piss a bit, like I do feel for them, because they like the core skill set of most salespeople who are good at their jobs is being good at building relationships with people and understanding what they need, and whether you can actually usefully sell them something based on their current role. Whereas half the time now they're getting forced to like learn tools and technology that are not perceived to be particularly valuable. And where I've got a lot of sympathy for them is like, particularly with the CRM debate, like, they spend half their lives updating CRMs and recording stuff. And the information never gets used by anyone. Like it just, sits. Like you say, it's that whole like hoarder mentality of like, oh, we're recording everything, so that's useful for somebody. But you're like, for who? Who's looking at that? Who's looking at these notes? What are you doing with them? Is anyone looking at them? Probably not. Which I definitely feel like people in biz dev or sales roles just get that immediately. They're like, well, no one's going to read it, are they?
It's not just sales. Customer support gets the same thing, right? Record all the customer support calls. They do surveys. Hang on the end of the phone and answer some questions about the service you got today, right? Where does that information go? Who is looking at that and using it to make improvements. And it's data, it's overwhelming data, and it's
Yeah.
capturing data for data's sake unless you actually do something with it, and risking damaging the customer relationship, because again, they're like, I don't want to answer another survey, right? How many of these surveys do I need to do every time I talk to you?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah. You're like,
there
it's the
needs
same
to
as last
be,
time. Right?
yeah, exactly. And so there needs to be thought behind it. And I guess bringing it back around to, you asked a question before about strategy, like, so is some of this disconnected from the company strategy? And I think, yes, overall, like if you're not
Mm,
collecting information that's going to give you insight into, is your strategy working or not, then why are you collecting it? It, it,
yeah.
it doesn't make sense. And I find this, so the work I do around customer and partner advisory boards, one of the big things that I focus on is that feedback cycle, because I've seen a lot of those advisory boards just be talk fests. They're great conversations, everybody has a good time, or they become bitch fests and people just complain about everything. But either way, you're capturing useful information, but is
Yeah.
it information that you needed to know? Is it information that is actually going to help you make improvements? And is that information getting back to the people, the teams in your organization who can actually do something with it and make those
Mm,
improvements? Quite often, I see that's broken in a lot of organizations. They're putting a lot of effort into doing these advisory boards, and a lot of time goes into it. And if you look at the dollar amount of brain power in the room in some of these things, it's just astounding. And then it ends up for nothing, right?
yeah.
Maybe you're left with a good impression, but that's not translating into
But that's kind of it, right?
actual business benefit. Yeah.
I think that I think you've hit on the crux of the frustration for like myself and many people is exactly that. It's like what is the point of doing this stuff? Like from my my brief time working client side in big businesses, it was exactly the same. There's always I did a lot of like frontline stuff, like worked in call centers and worked on kind of customer facing roles, and there's a constant array of stuff like that. It's like surveys, capturing data, it was like note making, but you're like who's using it? You can tell that people aren't using it because of the experience you're delivering, like
Yeah.
on the calls. Like it doesn't get used. I'm like, when I used to work for Bank West years ago in the UK, and they were a classic for like there was loads of stuff you had to capture, but then you were like, it's not kind of coming back to me to more
Mm,
usefully inform like my my job. So
yeah.
where is it going? Like I'm the one that's talking to people who at the time like had lost their cards and needed them to be reissued. But like, yeah, it was pretty fascinating because
Yeah.
I feel like the amount of data and the amount of tools now is kind of making people scared that if you don't have that, you can't make any useful decisions or like do anything. It's like almost a bit of a comfort blanket to be like, oh no, we need to look at the
Yeah.
data. Someone needs to send me a report first. It's like, well, do you need that though?
Or it can mask over things again, where you're looking at just
Yeah,
like a basic NPS score. An NPS score says everything's hunky dory, but you're having all this massive customer churn, right? It doesn't match up because you're not asking the right question, right?
yeah,
Or, going back to like, is the feedback I'm giving even being heard? Employee experience is another classic area for that, right? You do regular employee surveys, people are doing exit interviews, you've got, feedback that your manager asks for, during your performance reviews. Where does that information go? And is that making any benefits to what the employee experience is? Because we know there's a direct correlation between having kind of engaged, understanding, happy employees and the service that they give to customers, and how
yeah.
motivated they are, to better serve customers and make improvements. And I think it's exactly the same thing. I think customer look at it in the broad lens and say your employees are also your customers, and understand that you have to apply the same thing. Stop surveying them if you're not actually going to do
Yeah.
anything with the information that you're gathering.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's just, it comes back to the point you made. I think at the very start, right? It's just to treat people like like actual people, not like numbers on a spreadsheet that you're just
People
dealing
want
with
to
every
buy from
day.
people, right? That's at the end of the day, particularly if you're making, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a CFO or a CIO who's out making a multi-million dollar investment for their company, and like their reputation's on the line. People are looking to them to do the right thing. by the company, by the shareholders, by et cetera, et cetera. Like that, again, that's a different kind of heightened emotional experience, but it's an emotional experience nonetheless. They're worried, they're concerned, there's a bit of pride in it. And, so you got to treat it again. It's a human experience that they're having, and they want to be educated and handheld and be given some comfort that they're making the right decision. And that's not going to come from being sent automated emails or something like that. That's going to come from personal conversations.
Yes, I totally agree with that, and I think that's one of the things that people get so wrong. I think is just not reading the room, basically, right? Where you're like, yes, sort of like imagine you're kind of on a first date and just make some incredibly horrible faux pas comment. Like that's kind of what the experience is like a lot of the time, right? When you're like dealing with companies, they're like, oh great, you've signed up, wonderful, and leading into your other point about sort of expanding relationships, there's a lot of received wisdom about that, right? Where you're like, oh, if someone's just bought something, that's the ideal time to try and sell them something else, which I don't necessarily subscribe to universally. Or do you need to prove some value first and let them settle in and then do it? Like that's delicate depending on what you're trying
Mhm.
to actually sell to people. So I mean, from your point of view, is there a right or a wrong way to do that, Jen? Like, is there a great way that you've seen people kind of look to expand upon relationships that they've started already, or is it a real case by case thing based on your industry and product and the sort of nature of your business?
I mean, I think the fundamentals are consistent across all of those areas. Is like, one, we've sold them the product. Are they actually using it? Because the likelihood they're going to use more of it or use something else from you if they're not actually using the product you've sold them in the first place is pretty slim. Um,
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah,
and again, particularly in the SaaS environment, we see that, like, you said with your Miro licenses, you had one user who wasn't even using the license, right? So why would they sell you any more licenses if you have ones that aren't already being used? So, very particular, again, in that subscription model area. Um, and then knowing the customer needs. I guess, that there's an expectation that, once I'm your customer, you should start building an understanding of what I'm going to need next. And so if you start throwing a lot of things at me that have no relation to what I need at all, or no relation to the type of business I am, or, type of user I am, or anything like that, then kind of like, well, you should get to know me. We now have established some level of relationship. So I think it's, putting the effort into understanding the customer, understanding what they need, understanding the experience that they're having, and waiting, again, back to that point, like, don't try to sell more to a customer that's in escalation.
Mm.
Look at it and say, is this the right timing? Because they're using the product, they seem happy with the product, they don't seem to be having too many issues with the product. We know that they have a need for it. And then, understanding who actually makes that decision and engaging them in a conversation, and there might be multiple thems in complex sales engagements. You're going to have, it's no longer often a single purchaser, it's a team of
Yeah.
purchasers, and they're all going to have different motivations for and needs for what they're looking for. A procurement person's looking at one thing, a finance person's looking at another, a business user is looking at one thing, an IT person, a security person. They all have different requirements, and you have to show that you understand that and tailor the information accordingly.
Yeah, look, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I suppose this is one of the areas where there's an extra layer of complexity, right? Where if you're in, as you've noted, like if you draw a sort of pretty crude line between um, your standard, usually B2C products, that's like a one person decision maker. They just buy it, they don't buy it. Typically, you'll have one person who's in charge of it, and they're the person you engage. That's pretty straightforward, right? Um, well, I mean, not based on what we just said, but it should be straightforward. Let's say that. But then if you're selling to a group, as you've noted, and this is like obviously like territory that we're very familiar with, that becomes exponentially more challenging, where you're trying to engage sometimes people who are just there to say no, for example, which is obviously a challenge to work around. But what if you're looking at that kind of buying group type scenario, is there a way you've seen people approach that really well and say, look, like, is there sort of information that you can collectively present back to those people? I know the traditional received wisdom is always, get your champion and your sort of influencers together and your key decision makers, and like they're the ones that you sort of support and spearhead. But are there other ways that you've seen people approach that? And what would you say from the information that we've talked about is really essential to sort of support those conversations if you're going to go into them? Like, what do you need to be looking at before you start them, I guess?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was quite a lot of questions at the same time. But,
no,
feel free
that's
to
okay. Yeah. I mean,
work through
again,
those in whatever order.
I think, my thought process goes to one, first get an understanding of who is in that buying committee so that you know how to, who you're engaging with and what you need to do. I'm not a massive fan of personas from the traditional sense of personas. I think they're generally too high level and, here's Bob. Bob's an IT manager. Bob is married with 3 kids and has a golden retriever. Like, that's not a great persona. But I learned many years ago from a group I worked with that one of the best ways to build personas is to put the effort in to understand what are the questions they're asking themselves at each step of that buying journey. And then it allows you to preempt those with information to basically be able to go to a CFO and say, when we get to an evaluation stage in the buying journey, a CFO is looking for these key pieces of information to put their mind at ease and make it easy for them to say yes and move to the next stage. If you know those, you can build content in presentations and pieces of material, et cetera, that you can put in front of that CFO ahead of time to say, I know you're going to be looking for this. Let me make it easy for you, right? And doing that with the procurement, doing that, et cetera. And again, they're going to have different information. So building almost like a little content map around what they're going to need at what stage and being able to, replicate that and tailor it accordingly, I think is important. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is looking at peer-to-peer conversations. So get your technical architects involved early in a sales process, talking to their, architects and developers and do that. Get your finance team talking to their finance team. Get your legal teams talking early, right? So don't put it all, if, again, it's smaller organizations may not be able to do that at scale, but certainly on their must-win accounts, put the effort in to match your team with their team so that you can have peer-to-peer conversations, because again, there's going to be that greater level of empathy and understanding for what they're looking for, what they're going through, feeling like they have a trusted partner on the other side of the table.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, because one of our clients is big on partner sales as well, because they're a technology business, like a data technology business, but it's very much behind the scenes infrastructure type stuff. So they can directly sell, but you need a lot of people who know a lot of things on the other side to be able to actually deploy the solution. And it's very, very specific to like very case by case. They do a lot in like healthcare and finance. But they spend a lot of time doing that. It's like, they have partners per market that they operate in across Asia Pacific. And the partners often specialize in a specific area. That there might be data viz, there might be like infrastructure, there might be like database people. So, that's the exact approach. It's like, it's really complicated because there's them, their partner, and the client, and then often other, solution teams in the mix. But that, that's their sort of, their headline is that it's like a trusted partner. We know what we're doing. We'll come in, we'll engage and consult with everyone. And, it's your classic, like long sales funnel for them, because it can take sort of 12 to 18 months to work through requirements, understand what's happening. Is it even feasible? Like, how does it all work? Prove the concept, all that stuff. But, back to what you were saying earlier, that approach then builds very long lasting relationships with them, because they're a sticky technology anyway, because they're like, they're in there in the guts of the business once they're in. But, proving that trust up front is what wins them long range, long term, very valuable relationships. So it definitely works. I just I don't see as many people sort of putting the kind of effort that they do in across the board from other people we've worked with, which is surprising.
It is hard because people are, resource constrained when it comes to technical resource, pre-sales versus, sales, etc. So you might not be able to do it on every single piece of business, but certainly the big one, where it's it's worth. You usually get a much better, from what I've seen in my experience, you get a much better result by putting that peer-to-peer effort in.
Totally. And look, I think a lot of it comes back to my old business partner was very fond of saying, like, it's like dating before you marry, right? Where you're like, you don't, if you were single, run into a room full of whomever you're interested in and start like throwing engagement rings at everyone who's available to see if one lands on a finger. Like
Yeah,
you get to know people and you make sure that you're compatible in some way, right? And that there's some
yeah,
level of interest in each other, and then things progress from there. So
yeah. Well, I always say to clients I'm working with, just because you're ready to sell does not mean they're ready to buy.
yeah,
So, you need
yeah,
to be continually getting in front of them. And again, working a lot in the kind of B2B enterprise and government space. Government particularly have protracted sales processes and, long, multi-year contracts and things like that. You just need to consistency. You just need to consistently
yeah.
be in front of them and building up your brand and building up the awareness and not try to jump straight into that lead gen discussion where like, hey, I've got this, do you want to buy it? But,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
more
Look,
just,
look at this stuff. Do you
yeah.
want it right now? Quick, run to the next person. They weren't interested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a long
It's
game. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, totally. And like it's something I find quite fascinating having because I've done a lot of work on B2C as well. And obviously the ability to identify a sales need is much easier there because often you're just selling something that people either want or need or both. But the people who built like really good brands also combine that with that long range view of like, you need to also stand for something because otherwise you're just one thing among many things and it becomes very hard to then, differentiate and stand out. Um, but yeah, like it just I think that's it, right? Like I think again you mentioned this earlier that one of the big problems that I think everyone has right now is like just real short termism everywhere on the strategy allegedly or lack of strategy in businesses all ends up being pulled right back to like how we do next quarter, how we do for the rest of this year,
Yeah.
which is not obviously is a consideration because that's what your strategy should deliver, but it shouldn't like drive the strategy itself. Performing against your short-term targets should be a function of a good strategy, not like, the thing that's controlling what your thinking is.
Yeah. I see that a lot in the marketing space. The CMO group, meetups that I coordinate, we had a whole conversation around kind of brand versus lead gen, and we were finding particularly, here in Asia Pac, we've got a lot of field services teams, right? So they're not
Mm,
necessarily setting the strategy or doing the work. They're mostly being asked to do execution pieces of global campaigns and reliant on budgets coming down from global but also dictating what those budgets can be used for. And there's a huge sense of frustration. Again, this is more in the kind of enterprise B2B or medium-sized business up B2B space, but basically every dollar they spend has to generate a lead within a short period of time. And, they're pushing back
right.
saying, again, and particularly in some markets, Japan as a good example, Korea is a good example where relationships are so critical in those
Yeah.
markets. Or, if you're working in the government space, again, relationships are so critical and trust is so critical, and you can't build that overnight. And so to expect, to spend a dollar, get a dollar back from a lead immediately is unrealistic when working, having worked for an ERP vendor, like people replace those things every 15 to 20 years, right? You
Yeah.
have to be, you can't expect like, I'm going to go out and have an event and have 30 people there and 30 people are going to want to buy an ERP tomorrow. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
but
just
that's what their
take the
KPIs.
contracts with you. Go
Exactly.
for it.
But their KPIs are pushing them in that direction, and they're not having a lot of luck pushing back. Because again, there's we've got to meet this quarter, we've got to meet that next quarter. You need to have a pipeline that looks this way. And
Mm.
yeah, so it's actually to the long-term detriment, because again, they're building short-term, like small deals as opposed to building long-term consistent pipelines that, have good rolling revenue.
I think that's a really interesting point actually, because without getting too sort of off piece, like the rest of the team and I talk a lot about sort of sustainable growth and like, do you think that's driven by the fact that there's a lot of pressure for businesses to be like constantly growing at a certain rate, because that seems to be a factor in a lot of the conversations that we have, and seems relatively arbitrary, depending on whether they're privately owned or are publicly traded. But
You just make the
that seems,
assumption that your targets for next year are going to be this year plus 10 to 20%, like
yeah.
that, regardless of what has happened in the market, regardless of losing resources, regardless of demand gen budgets being cut. It always seems like I very rarely see a reduction in budgets. It's
Yeah.
the targets are always going. Sorry, reduction in targets. The targets are always going up regardless of what's happening. And again, a lot of these are publicly listed companies. There's shareholder expectations.
Because that's where you would assume there's, based on everything we've been saying, there's kind of a ceiling, right? Like logically, there has to be a ceiling of how much a business can grow. Assuming that you're owning your market, you have a product, it does certain things. Like, I mean, obviously we're going through this at the moment. So this is very top of mind, putting together like our, kind of figures for growth markets for next year. But you're like, look, the market's only so big. There's only so many people that are going to want what you're selling. And
Yep.
if you've already sold to X percentage of those people, like the actual growth opportunity is not going to be probably anywhere near as the one that you're setting. But I think to your point earlier, this is where there's a lot of like, not a lot of actual science applied, right? It's people just being like, as you said, just add 10% next year to the sales budget. And
Well,
then that's it.
it's simple sales strategy, isn't it? You either create new products to sell, you find a new segment of the market to go into, you acquire a competitor to pick up their market share, right? There are a couple of levers you can pull there to be able to do that, but you can't rely on selling the same thing over and over with no change.
Yeah.
Because again, unless you've got expect massive customer churn and people are coming in and using it once and then done with it, and that could be fine. Or using it once or twice a year and then fine. Like my accountant does my same tax once a year. I don't need anything from him in between.
You're like,
so
that's fine.
that's
just
fine.
Get it done.
Exactly.
Just get it done.
He doesn't need to offer new solutions every year. He just needs to do my tax every year. So unless you're that sort of business. But again, this coming back to this customer retention perspective, like this is why you need to be constantly looking at that, either improving the product you have, adding new features and benefits, looking for that cross-sell, upsell, right? Or at least doing enough to retain that customer.
Yeah. Look, I definitely agree with that, and I think the to your point, like a lot of the challenge around this stuff is like the thinking's often done kind of in a vacuum, right? Where you're like, look, the state of the world is like this right now, and you obviously naturally have to do a bit of a freeze frame on that to be like, how's everything working? Like, where are we at? But obviously the nature of real life is that it's not like that at all, and things are changing all the time.
No. And as a sales manager, I mean, I've gone through this process and I've worked with sales teams where it's just, you just have to build your business case for what realistically you can achieve. And you get, say, I think I can do this because of what I see in the market, do the market research, understand what opportunities are out there, say, okay, realistically, this is what I can achieve. This is a stretch target for me. Like this, I know I can commit to, and then, the constant reviewing of it. But very rarely do I see, again, you push back on, the global team that set your target and they reduce it for you significantly,
It's definitely
like, okay, we won't make a 10% uplift, we'll make it a 9% uplift. Great.
Yeah. They'll be like, look, if we hit 9, that's fine, but the target's 10. So
and your stretch target is 15.
Yeah, that's very familiar territory as well, that right? I think look, we covered a lot of ground there. That was super interesting. What should you be trying to find out from your customers that's going to be really valuable for a business?
Yeah, I think it again comes down to business need. They obviously have certain pressures on them. They're having the same pressures on their budgets that we'd be having, same in terms of finding the skills that they need to do the jobs that they need to do. So I think it's understanding the pressures that they're under, and then being clear on your value prop of how you can help address those particular issues, right? And being flexible in terms of your commercials too. That's the other thing I'd say, again, because those budgets are going to be tight. How can you work with them so that there's a big risk. One of the biggest risks you have is they're just going to defer decisions. So how can you work with them to get a decision across the line that's going to help see them through this period?
I like that. I think flexibility on commercials is a big one. I know I'm seeing both ends of the spectrum there, so it's definitely a good point to end on, I think. But look, that was super interesting. Thanks for joining, Jen. That was a much broader ranging discussion than I was anticipating, but there's some super interesting stuff in there. So look, thanks again for coming on. It was awesome to chat to you.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
That, friends, is a wrap on our time with Jennifer Arnold discussing the voice of the customer. Thank you once again for listening. I hope you learned some things as I did on that journey through customer relationships. If you haven't checked out the first 2 episodes, please go back and have a listen to those. There's some great stuff in there, and I will catch you again in a couple of weeks.